Okay, thank you for this flattering introduction. I hope I will be able to live up to all the expectations, at least to some extent. And I think the research which I will be presenting today is familiar to many of you. I'm not going to present really new studies, but rather I will go through a series of research stretching all the way down to 1988 and until recently, when I published my first study together with Professor Kirsti Lagerspets, my professor and mentor at that time, our first study on indirect aggression. And Kirsti Lagerspets, I want to mention her especially, as she was also one of the founding persons of ISRA. So that can be worth noting for those of you who didn't know it already. And we had this research lab in Turku in Finland, where I was staying at that time. And she really got me into aggression research. I don't know whether I would have got into it otherwise if it wasn't for her. Maybe I would, because there's something that I always found fascinating about aggression, human aggression. Why are people aggressive? How can you stop it? All those eternal questions. Let's see. Now, at that time, the late 80s, there was a common view in aggression research that women, this is really surprising, but people might have forgotten about it. But at that time, people really thought that women are not really aggressive at all. And just to quote Arnold Buss, who wrote a famous book on aggression in 1961, he wrote that women are so seldom aggressive that female aggression is not worth the trouble to study. And Dan Alveus, who was the first studying bullying in schools, he suggested that bullying in schools seems to exist only among boys, and he didn't study it among girls at all. Now, in our research group, we started doubting that for many reasons. And we may consider why female aggression wasn't studied before to the same extent that it is today. And previous research focused mainly on physical aggression. We didn't consider previous aggression research, didn't consider so-called subtle forms of aggression like verbal and indirect. They were simply neglected. Another reason might be that most research at that time was conducted by males. There were really few aggression researchers who were women at that time. Still, you know, it's not unknown in history that women can be very aggressive. And a famous painter from Italy, Artemisia Gentileschi, he painted this picture of Judith beheading Holofernes. And she painted several pictures like this, usually showing women who were terribly aggressive towards men. And of course, not surprised, she had a history of, you know, severe abuse from men. So at least there is, historically, it's been well known that women can be aggressive. Almost. Now, funny though, if you look at laboratory studies from this period in social psychology, the laboratory studies suggested already at that time that women could be actually as aggressive as men. But it was somehow not really, you know, the people weren't paying so much attention to it. And if you look at the intensity in the experience of anger, there were lots of studies showing that women could feel exactly the same amount of anger as men did. Absolutely no difference. And that's maybe shouldn't be surprising. Why should they? But the other point shown in social psychological laboratory research was that actually when not in danger of being exposed, men and women behave actually equally aggressively. If you used, for instance, the teacher-learner paradigm, the bus machine, studies like that. So actually, is it correct to say that men are more aggressive than women? Of course, if you look at criminal records, it's definitely true that men commit more violent crimes and more murder. But if you look at aggressive from a more experiential point of view, anger and being aggressive when you're not get exposed, and suddenly women are equally aggressive. And this, of course, has been shown in cartoons. I like this cartoon. It was really typical example of indirect aggression. A woman who's shooting the ship behind the back of her colleague or whatever, competitor, maybe we should say. And this is another cartoon which I really like, because it's sort of really the expression of indirect aggression, social manipulation in the workplace bullying, that we all know so well. I guess all of us have experienced these situations like the one depicted here. Well, anyway, in our research group, we wanted to study sex difference in aggression, and the reason was that we really felt that something was severely wrong in the popular notion that women were non-aggressive. And we conducted a pilot study with interviews with school children, which revealed a pretty grim picture of girls bullying, which showed that, contrary to Daniel Weber's claim, girls could behave really very aggressively towards each other. And the aggression was mostly of indirect nature and could be really quite long-lasting. The girls described it as they became enemies for life. That's how they felt it, at least. So we decided to study this quantitatively and started constructing scales for measuring different forms of aggression. And we called it the direct and indirect aggression scales, the DIAS. And it was based on peer estimations, which was actually quite popular at that time. You know, Raoul Huseman used peer estimation in his studies, and Donald Weyers used kind of peer estimation. Actually, it was a dichotomous yes or no thing. Later, we have also established simpler techniques like the mini DIA, which is based on self-estimation, and the revised version from 2015, which can be used, very easily when you together with other research batteries. DIAS is actually quite long, quite many items in it. And based on factor analysis, we received 3 factors: direct physical aggression, and direct verbal aggression, and indirect aggression. And typical items of physical aggressions were hits, kicks, trips, shoves, takes things, pushes, and pulls. And items of direct verbal aggression, like yells, argues, insults, calls names, teases, and says he or she is going to hurt the other one. And indirect aggression, you can see that we were pretty interested in this stuff because we had 12 items, and I'm not going to read them all, but shutting the other one out of the group, become friends with another one as revenge, ignores the other one, gossips, tells bad or false stories, plans secretly to bother the other one behind his back, and so on. And indirect aggression is actually can be regarded as a kind of social manipulation. Sometimes we prefer to call it actually social manipulations as a term, where the perpetrator simply pretends that he or she has no aggressive intentions. And the main benefit of this is, of course, that it reduces the risk of retaliation in comparison with physical and direct verbal aggression. And as I already mentioned, we based it on peer estimations. So when using data were collected by peer estimations, every individual in the class estimated how much every other pupil in the class behaved in a specific way. That's the items in this case. And which were a total of 24 items. And the responses were made on a 5-point scale ranging from 0 to 4, never too very often. And the sum score of a subscale, physical, verbal, or indirect, were divided by the number of items in the scale in order to keep the response range from 0 to 4. And besides peer estimated data, we also collected teachers' estimations and self-estimations. And we checked, of course, how well they correlated with the peer estimations. And as probably many of you know, teachers' estimations did not correlate very well with neither peer estimations nor self-estimations. But peer estimations and self-estimations correlated significantly with each other, but self-estimated scores tended to be much lower than peer-estimated scores, probably due to some kind of self-serving attribution bias. We also tried out boys' estimations of boys' behavior and girls' estimations of girls' behavior. And these within-sex estimations actually, I think, are the most accurate ones, since aggression is pretty much within sex phenomenon, not totally, but pretty much so. And our first study published in 1988 is indirect aggression typical of girls. Here we investigated adolescents at age 15. And as you can see, when it comes to verbal aggression, there were not really any significant difference between boys and girls. Still, verbal aggression was the most used form of aggression, which makes sense, I think. Physical aggression, as expected, was more commonly used by boys, and indirect aggression more commonly used by girls. And this was the first study we made. Then came another one in 1992, where we studied indirect aggression and also, of course, verbal and physical at ages 8, 11, and 15. And then we added on with estimations from age 18. And as you can notice from this picture depicting kicking, which is the one form of physical aggression, boys used it much more. And especially, it's interesting to note this peak at age 11, both boys and girls. But at the age 18, boys didn't really use kicking so much anymore in the peer group. And it makes sense because if 18-year-old boys start kicking each other, you know, they're so strong that the results are quite horrible. So physical aggression has a tendency to go down in the normal population at age 18. You will still see a sex difference at age 15. And here we have direct verbal aggression. I think it was verbal abuse, which was depicted here. And here you can notice that, sorry, it keeps jumping for me all the time. At age 8, the scores were quite low, but age 11 was again showed the strongest scores, and then the scores were lower at ages 15 and still at age 18. And then indirect aggression, you would have the highest scores again at age 11, and then the scores were going down. But here you would have like a sex difference at from age 11 onwards. And you might ask, why is there an aggressive peak at age 11? Now we think, of course, there could be other explanations, but we think that the peak should be interpreted as a sign of, excuse me, social activity in the peer group going on at that period. The adolescents are giving and taking in aggressive encounters and establishing hierarchies. And then when puberty arrives, they tend to become more interested in establishing love relationships, and the peer group in the class is not so important anymore. Okay. Then we received money from the Academy of Finland to conduct a large-scale study where we studied this phenomenon cross-culturally. We studied participants at age 11, 8, 11, and 15 from Finland, India, Israel, Italy, Poland, Puerto Rico, Russia, Ukraine, and the United States. And it was basically based on the direct indirect aggression scales and based on peer estimated scores as described already. And then we used some other measurements as well, but I will not go so much into that. And here are the results from, you can't see the sign here, but actually these are results from Finland, Poland, Italy, and Israel, I think. And I think we published this in something like 98. And here you can notice trends for boys. Let's see, I missed the girls. The girls, 98, yes, I was correct. For physical, verbal, and indirect aggression. And you can see that physical aggression especially goes down very drastically for girls. And in the proportion of indirect aggression is clearly the highest. And this is in percentage of total aggression scores. And I will go back later to, I will discuss a little bit later the difference between proportional scores and raw scores. And here you see the same for boys in the same 4 countries. And you see the relatively high scores of physical aggression. Really striking. But the indirect aggression scores are really low. And among the 15-year-old boys, they're down to 20%. Then we studied also something called, I'm sorry again, because you can't probably see it. This is, I can't get this green thing away, but it's the attribution discrepancy index in indices, ADI. And they show the difference between peer-estimated scores and self-estimated scores. Because respondents try to embellish themselves in self-estimated aggression scores due to the self-serving attribution bias, which I mentioned before. And we wanted to study this phenomenon a little bit more. Sorry. So the ADI scores may be actually seen as an indication about norms regarding different types of aggression in a particular subgroup in a society. And positive scores, meaning that the self-estimated scores of aggression are higher than the peer-estimated scores, should show an acceptance of the behavior in question in this particular ethnic group. And here you will see ADI scores for 8-year-old girls from 5 different ethnic groups. And this was published also, I think, around 98, where you can see that we have Finnish-speaking boys and girls, girls only, sorry, this is only about girls, Finnish-speaking girls from Finland, Swedish-speaking girls from Finland, Polish girls from Warsaw, Caucasian girls from Chicago, and African American girls from Chicago. Some former ISRA presidents were helping us with collecting the data. Adam Franczyk in Poland and Raoul Huseman from Chicago. He was living in Chicago at that time. And what is striking here is maybe that the Polish girls had higher self-estimated scores than peer-estimated girls. So they wanted actually to portray themselves as aggressive. And for the Caucasian girls in Chicago, with the exception of indirect aggression, they also wanted to present themselves as aggressive. So this means that there are ethnic differences regarding this ADI scores. There's something to do with the social desirability in the ethnic groups. And also we investigated the role of religion. And we studied physical, verbal, and indirect aggression and religious belonging in India and Israel, where you could study different religious groups very well. And here you can see then results for let's see now. This is, again, this is physical aggression among Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs in India, and then among secular Jews and Orthodox Jews in Israel. And you can notice the usual peak at age 11, with one clear exception, and that is the Sikh boys, who were really very physically aggressive at age 8. And also the Sikh girls were more aggressive than the other groups. So there must be some reason why the Sikhs are so aggressive. And this is based on peer estimations now. And I think personally that the reason is that the Sikhs in India have historically been discriminated against, and they've been persecuted. For instance, the Sikh gurus, I don't know if it was the first or the fifth, or probably the fifth or something like that, who established the rule that the Sikhs should defend themselves against persecution. And all Sikh boys have to wear a knife. And all male Sikhs have to wear a knife, for instance. They also have to wear the long hair and all that stuff. But it was sort of the norm that you should, they didn't consider aggression to be bad in that sense. And here is verbal aggression, and again, the Sikhs stand out as very aggressive, and the Indian kids more aggressive than the Israeli kids. And here we have indirect aggression, and still the typical peak at age 11, which is so typical. And here is another thing, which I think is, well, anyway, if I could go back to this, the thing which is interesting in my opinion about this study is that ethnicity and religion clearly plays a role, because in the Indian kids, the Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs, they are basically the same genetic compound. They're genetically identical, but they have different religions. So these differences must simply be attributed to religion and ethnic norms within their religion. Some. Now, one thing which I think is very interesting too, and is that if you look at the target of aggression, and this is based on our Finnish studies, that the sex of the target when the aggressor is female is mostly another female in 52% of the cases. And the target is more often male than female, it's only 20% of the cases, and equally often male and female, 28% of the cases. Now looking at males, when the aggressor is a male, then the sex of the target is also most often another male. But more often than for girls, the target could be one of the other sex. So boys are aggressive towards girls too, but mostly, but in the majority, not in more than 50%, but anyway, more often so against boys. And this certainly has to be explained in some way. And the fact that peer aggression in school is mostly directed towards individuals from the same sex, in my opinion, should be interpreted in line with evolutionary psychology. Then the two sexes have their own hierarchies, and the individual tries to achieve a good status within that hierarchy. It makes sense, because that's where you have to show that you're strong, and later you'll be able to compete for partners of the other sex. Now, one thing that we also became interested in is the developmental of these three types of aggression. And we came to suggest that they can also be seen as developmental stages based on the effect-danger ratio, which I will soon come to. That physical, verbal, and indirect aggression can be seen as three developmental stages, succeeding and partly overlapping each other, but they will exist beside each other to some extent all through life. Before a small child has developed a language, it can simply only be physically aggressive because he doesn't have any other methods. When it has developed a language, it can add verbal aggression to its repertoire. And when it has developed a certain amount of social intelligence, it can also be indirectly aggressive. So there should be a connection somehow between social intelligence, social manipulation, and indirect aggression. And we postulated that the individual learns to use aggressive methods that are as effective as possible, while at the same time avoiding exposure to danger. Verbal aggression avoids danger by putting distance between the opponents. And indirect aggression does the same thing and to even a greater extent. The opponents might not even be in the same room, and still you can be aggressive. And looking at it from the developmental point of view, without a language, a baby is like an animal in a sense. It has to resort to physical aggression. It starts with biting. I'd like to see somebody studying this, in observational studies in families. I have not been able to do it, but I, of course, made my own studies, with my own kids and others' kids. And I'm pretty convinced that this holds to a great extent. That the first type of aggression a baby uses is really biting. I've seen this many times, that the baby bites the mother's breast and maybe the mother's arm. And then comes pinching. The baby pinches with her thumb and her index finger. And then comes hair pulling. She pulls the hair, maybe of the mother or somebody else. Then when the baby learns to stand on her feet or his feet, she can start shoving and pushing. And then when she gets better balance, she can do hitting, and then she can do kicking, which requires more balance. I think this is my prediction that what you would find if you would do systematic research and when these types of physical aggression develop. And then when the child learns verbal skills, it of course makes verbal aggression possible, which is so much more effective. Shouting, threatening, name calling, and so on. And I'm not going to suggest any developmental trend there, which comes first. Maybe just simply shouting, and then threatening and name calling comes later. And then when the social intelligence develops, it makes manipulative, aggressive behavior, malicious gossiping, social exclusion in the peer group possible. But that's already then peer group behavior that you would see in sibling rivalry and also in peer groups in kindergarten. And my guess is that the first example of indirect aggression that you would see is actually in sibling rivalry, when one child goes to the parent and says, she did that, and she hit me, and she took this, although you told us that we were not allowed to take that, and so on. And children very quickly learns this can be very effective, especially if you manages to lure the parent into, punishing the wrong child. Now, in order to test the hypothesis that social intelligence is a prerequisite for indirect aggression, we wanted to do this, but we encountered a problem, because all existing tests for social intelligence regarded empathy to be a part of social intelligence. And we wanted to measure pure social intelligence without empathy, because empathy is known to mitigate aggression. It would confound the results. So we had to construct new instruments for this. And the idea was that social intelligence minus empathy, if you subtract empathy scores from social intelligence scores, then we would land at indirect aggression. And this we wanted to test. And we started constructing scales for peer-estimated social intelligence and peer-estimated empathy. And my colleague Ari Kaukiainen actually used this as part of his Ph.D. thesis. And here are some examples of items for peer-estimated social intelligence. Notices easily if others lie, is able to get along with people, easily accommodates to new people and new situations, able to get his or her wishes carried out, is able to guess the feelings of others, and so on, knows how to get others to laugh. And I don't remember the alpha scores now, but they were more than 0.80. And then we also constructed a scale for peer-estimated empathy, helps classmates in trouble, comforts others when they are sad, is able to feel joy about the success of others, avoid hurting others' feelings. I think he or she understands how I feel, and so on. And then we studied social intelligence and empathy and 3 types of aggression: indirect, verbal, and physical, and also 2 types of peaceful conflict resolution and withdrawal. And then we correlated social intelligence with these normal correlations, and then controlling for empathy, that we parted out the effect of empathy. And as you can see, indirect aggression correlated quite highly with social intelligence. Verbally correlated also with social intelligence, and even physical. So to some extent, social intelligence is required also for physical aggression. And then, of course, social intelligence correlated, of course, most strongly with peaceful conflict resolutions. Now then, looking at the partial correlations, when we subtract the effect of empathy, then as expected, the correlations between indirect aggression and social intelligence increased from 0.55 to 0.65. The correlation between verbal and social intelligence increased from 0.39 to 0.54, and from physical from 0.22 to 0.38. And peaceful conflict resolution, as could be expected, went down from 0.80 to 0.51. So this, I think, is a nice little experiment showing that really social intelligence is important for indirect aggression, but it seems to be also important for for other types of aggression. Simply, you need to be a little bit smart to be successfully aggressive. And this is more like just to visualize, the relation between, on one hand, in social intelligence on this dimension, and empathy on these dimensions. So if you look at Hercule Poirot, so this is, let's go to literature now a little bit. Hercule Poirot, the detective in Agatha Christie's books, was high on social intelligence.
Sorry, Kyle, just remind you that we're nearing the end, so we go to Q&A. So if you could wrap it up in a few minutes, that'd be great.
Okay, I'll try to be quick then.
Okay, no worries.
I skip this then and go to some other things then. Of course, there's been some competing terminology about this, as you probably know, that our research group published our first article in indirect aggression in 88, 3 more in 92, and then additionally 2 in 94. And soon they came other terms, competing terms for more or less the same phenomenon, like relational aggression and social aggression. And I don't mind people using these terms if they prefer, but I still stick to indirect aggression. There's been some debate also if there really is a sex difference or not regarding indirect aggression. Because if you look at raw scores, we do not always find sex differences in indirect aggression. In some ethnic groups we do, but not in others. And according to a meta-analytic review of 148 studies on sex differences, they find only a small difference between indirect aggression favoring girls, rather a trivial one. But it should be mentioned, though, that most studies were based on self-estimations, where you can't exclude a self-serving attribution bias. And I think it would be worthwhile looking at peer-estimated scores only. But anyway, I'm considering the fact that boys overall have greater total aggression scores. I think the finding in the meta-analysis is not surprising and quite okay. But if you look at proportional scores, when you calculate the percentage of indirect aggression of respondents' total aggression scores, then you girls clearly use more indirect aggression than boys do. So in that sense, I think it seems correct to claim that indirect aggression is a type of aggression which is more typical of females. Like if you compare girls and boys' scores at age 15, you can clearly see that girls use indirect aggression much more proportionally than boys do. Can I say a few words of genetic and evolutionary aspects of indirect aggression? Or do you want me to stop here?
I'm happy for you to stop here just because I know that there's a lot of people who want to ask you questions. But if you want to continue, I'm also, I can go either way. I can listen to you speak for the next 3 hours, but
okay. Anyway, I can just say shortly that actually research shows that it's about 50-50 between genetic and environmental effects. And actually, I wanted to cite you, Tracy, that you have linked this directly to female within sex competition about males. And this explained the genetic factor, of course, which is 50% according to the research. And I agree totally with your opinion. So maybe I'll stop here then, so people can have their questions.
I think that's a great place to stop when you tell me I'm right. So perfect.